Right. Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm Parr Ferris, Conservation Manager at Devon Wildlife Trust. I come from Dartmouth and I still live down just outside Dartmouth on a little patch of land which I've sort of taken over from my parents-in-law. I'm not sure if they're happy about that or whether I should have had a bit more discussion with them. I had a couple of acres before which I've still held on to, and as with loads of you, I'm sure, I've tried all sorts and it's all gone wrong and everything's gone the way it shouldn't have gone and not where I intended it. And I'm quite happy with that. I'm just, letting it do its thing for a bit. And it's a learning curve for all of us. So I think one of the things about this sort of talk is that you don't have to get it right. You don't have to get everything to work as you intended right from the outset. You just need to get involved and have a go. So Donna asked me to do a talk about creating a nature reserve on an acre of land. I thought, okay, that's quite tricky. What can you do with an acre of land and how do you describe it? Donna also said, imagine this is for absolute beginners or for people who might be starting from, sort of relatively little knowledge on this subject. Might have lots of knowledge elsewhere, obviously, but and so I thought I'd use this guy. So I've got a young family, and anybody with a young family, you read all these kids' books, and this is a chap called Bob, the man on the moon. I thought, well, if he was coming from the moon and landed down on Earth, and he happened to have been given himself an acre of land, what on earth would he do with it, and how could he, as somebody who doesn't know this part of the world, doesn't know about managing land on Earth, then how can he progress with his little piece of land and turn it into that nature reserve, which he hopes will give him lots of happiness and bring about lots of nature on his land. So that's why I've used this chap. Forgive the cartoon-like element, and I should thank, who's he called? Simon Bartram, who's the author of that story. So when you first come across a piece of land, your instinct is to, you're really excited, I want to get stuck in, I want to get out there and do stuff. Brilliant. Don't. Just stop. I think the first thing you think when you come to a piece of land is what's it look like? I could do that to that. That doesn't look good. I could change that. And one of the things that it might look like an interesting piece of land, it might look like a really barren piece of land, but of course it might be the home to that one rare lichen that you can't even see without a magnifying glass or a pair of binoculars or something. You go and make a very simple change with really good meaning, and your barren looking piece of land that is actually a nature reserve, you've just turned into a barren piece of land. And so the first thing to do whenever you get a piece of land like this is just to stop, take your time, put the kettle on, have a cup of tea, and think about, okay, what are you going to do? So once you've stopped, you've taken a breath, it's really critical that you don't that you get to know your site. When you start with a piece of land, it can look like one thing. You go back in a different season, it looks completely different again. You go back 2 years later and it looks completely different again. Anyone who looks after land will recognise that. So it's really important that once you get a piece of land, and this is a particularly lovely piece of land at Meath that Devon Wildlife Trust manage, and it looked not always like this. It was a quite intensive quarry site in its history. Now it's an amazing landscape of a whole mixture of habitats. But when we first got that site, we just went for a walk. We went and looked round, go and have a look, dig into all the little nooks and crannies around that site and get to understand it. Is there a little pocket of a wet flush there? Is there a dry bit? Is there a bit of old sort of industrial concrete left in a corner there? What's going on around your land? And take your time. So look for different aspects of the land, look for where neighbours are, where access tracks are and all those sorts of things, and try to understand what your land's got about it. But don't just stop at your own land. So one of the things that I've worked a lot on over the last 10 years or so is how we look at managing land across larger landscapes. So when you get 1 acre, your instinct is to sort of just zoom in on your acre and just sort of focus on that. It's a big chunk if you've only ever had a garden. It's a very small chunk if you've used to managing farms. Either way, you could spend a lot of time just looking at that 1 acre and doing everything on there. But it's really important to just step back, go for walks around the countryside around it. Try to understand where is your little reserve. Chances are, I don't know if you can see these, it'll be in one of these little hollows here where, it's like the less productive bits of land or a difficult bit to manage, and that's why it's been sold off. Otherwise, it'd probably be part of a more intensive bit of land here. So go and have a look around, see how it relates to everything else around it. Is there another piece of land that looks a bit like yours that's down the way? Well, maybe go and have a chat with those people and see what they do with their land. Is it surrounded by agriculture? Is it on a ridge? Is it in a valley? Has it got, what sort of things are going on in that landscape? What does the landscape look like? How is it farmed? Try to go, obviously, looking a bit more intensively at the area around you, very close around you, and then as you go further away, just sort of get a feel for how that landscape works. And that's going to, all this information is going to feed in. You realise that this first half of the talk, I'm going to talk a lot about not doing anything, and in the second half of the talk, we'll talk a bit about doing stuff. So when you first get a piece of land, or even if you've got a piece of land and had it there for ages and not done anything with it, you've probably come to it with dreams. If Bob was up in the moon thinking about his acre, he'd probably be dreaming all sorts of stuff. And he'd probably be thinking, okay, wow, I can't wait to get my acre of land. It's going to be full of wildflowers. It's going to be a lovely wildflower meadow. It's going to be teeming with insects and birds, and it's going to be absolutely wonderful. The hedges are going to be lush and big and overflowing into the fields, and the woodlands are going to be all complex and old and the likes. And actually, more often than not, you get this sort of thing, and it's you get there and it's a bit of a monoculture of ryegrass and clover, and you sort of look at everything and go, wow, I can't understand where the wildflowers are. I can see one clover, and I can't see anything else. And when you look at the hedges, they're a bit like this. They're all sort of smashed down into a sort of thing that's just below hip height, and nothing can live in it, and the wind whistles through it, and there's nothing interesting there. So the point with this is that you shouldn't get despondent. That's a real opportunity for you to make your acre, which might be slap bang in the middle of here for some reason that the family's split the farm up and that's a little patch that got left. That's your opportunity to create a stepping stone in that environment and say, okay, what could I do? Could I link that habitat over there with that habitat over there? So don't get despondent, but sometimes those things present a lot more challenges than if you get the lovely lush stuff. But hopefully you have got some of that. And I wanted to just touch on habitats for a bit then. So hopefully within your land, and an acre is a small patch, but it can be very diverse depending on where it is. You can have any one of a whole range of habitats. And I should stress this talk, although it's for a meadows group, I'm going to touch on a whole range of habitats here. But clearly you could have anything from woodlands, heathlands, wetlands, rivers, streams, coastal areas. You could have blanket bog if you're up on the tops. What is a habitat? Well, a habitat is a community of plants, animals, fungi, bacteria even, interacting in a place, and they're regularly enough seen together for us to categorise them as a habitat. Now, a habitat is really an artificial thing come up with. These things don't know they're in a heathland or in a woodland. They're just a plant or an animal getting on with their lives. And when we categorise them as that, we quite often put them in a box and say, right, that's that and that's that. And actually, habitats aren't like that. They're much more dynamic. They move, they shift. A grassland that is abandoned and left will eventually succeed to a woodland. A woodland which is grazed out and trees fall over and die in the end, that can revert back to a grassland or another open habitat. Understanding what you've got in that habitat is going to be really important. It's made up of all these different components and they're complex. You need to take your time to go around and understand them and see what's in there. And so when I said about walking around the landscape around you, when you get to walk around it, go and find these little pockets of left habitat out there and have a look in them, see what there is, because it might be that on your little parcel you didn't notice it before, but that one little plant might be something that you don't see anywhere else except on that little bit of habitat that you know. Get used to looking into things, so not just standing back and looking at a habitat as sort of wallpaper, but what are the individual component bits of a habitat? What's in there? Is it a moss or a lichen? Is it a wildflower? Is it an invertebrate, a slug, or something that you hadn't spotted before? Get used to looking at all the little minutiae, and try and look at things over time. I said things move and shift. Try to look at, okay, what does that habitat just up the road look like in winter, and what does my land look like in winter? When you look at those things, you might see that actually the shape of the land actually is slightly different or very similar to what you've got. So being able to just compare and contrast with what you've got is really useful. I'll say it again. Slow down. Try and sit in. Go and get a deck chair and sit in the middle of your acre, but also these other habitats, and just sit there and watch. If you sit and watch, what you'll notice is things buzzing around you, things moving around. You might notice a plant that you didn't see before because you're actually taking time. When you walk through, we tend to walk through with purpose. None of us likes just sauntering at a really slow pace for a long time. We tend to get bored and we tend to move on. So looking and taking your time is a really key part of this. I said about habitats being made up of plants, fungi, animals. Animals are a part of that habitat. We often think of them as separate, and we often notice them more, probably because we're an animal and they move about and they catch our eye and all that sort of stuff. So we're good at noticing them, but they also are part of a set of processes. And when you've got more animals and more plants and more fungi within a habitat, it becomes more complex and it's got more of those processes in it, and it'll make it a more stable environment. I'll come on to natural processes a bit later on. So the more of these things that you've got, whether it's a Dartford warbler or a ring ouzel, or whether it's a crayfish, then you know that more and more about that habitat. How complex is it? How simple is it? In what sort of condition is it? So if you see an oil beetle wandering across your path that you regularly walk, you know you've got solitary wasps and bees, because that's what they feed on. If you see a great horseshoe bat whiz by at dusk, you know that not only you've got a whole range of insects there that you might not have seen, but you've probably also got big hedges somewhere, you've got foraging habitat, you've probably got a roost somewhere in the neighbourhood, and you've got the connectivity to get there. So you know, okay, I've just figured out a whole lot about my site without having to go anywhere other than my deck chair in the middle of my land. So sit and watch. But the other thing with these things is to record. Try and capture what you're seeing. So we quite often go, oh great, I saw a bat fly past the other day. That was brilliant. 3 weeks later, no memory of a bat going past. If somebody said, have you ever seen any bats? You go, no, I've never seen any bats around here. So write it down. When did you see it? So is that something in the autumn that you regularly see? Is it something in the summer that you regularly see? And then you start to understand how your little site interacts with its neighbourhood. And that's really important. So some species really rely not just on one site, but on multiple sites. I mentioned bats. There's a marsh fritillary there, which was in Donna's lovely and Robbie's lovely slides going around earlier on. They rely on having multiple sites. If you've got a marsh fritillary, you know you've got devil's bit scabious lurking somewhere on your site, even if you didn't know it and you can't identify devil's bit scabious, somebody might have told you that that's what you've got there, a marsh frit, and suddenly you know a bit more about your site. You also know it's connected to another site, because marsh fritillaries rarely operate on a single site. They normally have multiple sites around. So go and look for the other site where it is. So you can suddenly, by understanding what these different species are and the fact that they're a part of a habitat and a part of an ecosystem, not just animals in their own right, then you can start to understand a little bit about your area. Now you might see all of these things not on your land, which is more often than not the case actually. You sort of wander around and go, why isn't that coming here? I really want it on my bit. but that still tells you an awful lot about what you could be providing, and if you did something different, could I get those things onto my land? So it's really important, yeah, again, slow down, sit, get that deck chair out and look at what you've got. So some of these are a bit blurry. So there's other things to consider when you arrive at your piece of land, and so, you know, those who manage land will, you know, they'll recognise that, and it's the practicalities. So you come with dreams and aspirations, and you're thinking wildflower meadow, when I'm going to get out there and take hay, and then that's your land. Now you tell me how you're going to take a hay cut off of that land. It's going to be a pretty big job and pretty dangerous. So steepness of ground. How easy is it to get in there? Is it wet? Is it like, is there no tracks? Is there no way to get through it? Do you have to go through 7 different neighbours to get to your little acre, which happens to be in the bottom of a valley miles away, through little gateways that are about just squeezed through like that? That's all going to affect what you can do with your land, or maybe the things that you've got to do with neighbours before you can think about what you can do with your land. Are you near a town? And therefore, have you got people around that you could ask to help? You know, it might be volunteer groups in a village or in a town. And whereas if you're way out in the sticks, that might be quite hard. So understanding those practicalities is really important, just for thinking, okay, how am I going to do this? Am I on my own on this? Soils. There's a whole world of soils. Some of these are from many of you, I'm sure, will know Richard Smith, who works for the Environment Agency. He's sort of the professor of soils. He'd kill me for saying professor of soils. He says he's not a scientist. He is. So soils underpin everything that we do on the ground. If you don't take notice of your soils, you won't understand what you can and can't do with a nature reserve or any other piece of land. If you get it wrong, it can go really wrong. And this is this is in East Devon. Some of these scenes here, and when it goes wrong, if you put the wrong thing on the wrong soil, or manage it at the wrong time of year, or something of that sort, this is the sort of thing you can have. You can have soil just pouring off the ground, normally carried by water, and it ends up out there. And that's a shame for you, because you've just lost a resource. You probably put loads of effort in, but also you're causing problems for everybody around you as well and downstream. So understanding your soils is really important, and to that end, always carry a spade with you. If you're wandering out and about, or a trowel, anything, just a little spade and trowel, and go and have a look. So soils come in all different shapes, colours, sizes, and what they are depends on what means what you can create on that soil will be different. So if you're on a heavy clay, you're unlikely to make a lovely dry species-rich grassland. If you're on limestone, you're never going to make a peat bog, or it's very unlikely. So understanding your soil is really important, and you can look at them in various ways. So how acid are they? So you could do a soil sample, send it off, very cheap, get your local farm supplier to do a test for you. Just put them in a little bag and send them off. And then you can understand how much nutrients is in there. So we'll come on to nutrients in a bit, but if you've got too much of some nutrients, it's going to be hard to create the habitats you want. But also, look at the structure of the soil. So these ones down here, you've got slates in there, so that might create a little barrier. It might have a natural feature with it, but it's probably quite well draining. But some of them might end up, all these are pretty natural in their profiles, I think, but you can get some of this sort of waterlogging, or heavy clays, and you can get a cap where it's been compacted. You could get this sort of look here, which is quite sort of rich humus on the top, so that suggests that you could have like heaths or a bit of peat forming on that. By looking at this and getting some advice, I'll come on to advice in a minute, you can understand a lot about what you can and can't create, and do this across your acre, because a piece of land the size of this room will have variation in it. So understanding what this looks like is absolutely critical to going ahead and creating your reserve. And of course, that soil profile, what that looks like, probably depends on your previous management. Now, I would say that, as I said before, when if you're in those little pockets which are difficult to manage, it's unlikely it's like that. But of course, you might end up taking on a field that used to be maize or something of that sort, in which case you've got a different set of considerations. You should be able to walk onto your new piece of land or your old piece of land and look at it and go, yeah, I get that this is really, really intensively managed agricultural land, and therefore it's going to take a bit of work to create a nature reserve. But if you don't know that, maybe it's just been ploughed and left clear and all you can see is soil when you first turn up there. Go and speak to people, ask the neighbours, what used to go on here? Try and find out what the history was. Do those soil tests to see what the nutrient level is and what's going on there. By understanding the previous management, you'll understand a lot about what you could possibly do and how long it's going to take you to do it. Because you might have to make a lot of changes to the land if it's been very intensively managed. So understanding all that history is really important. Oh my word, there's some negatives in this one, isn't there? So yes, erosion and nutrients, you know, these three here are really important. So what are the challenges in taking on a piece of land? So we tend to go on and see all the positives when we first get it, and then about 6 months later, when you've spent a load on a contractor to do this and that and the other, and you needed to do something, go on holiday, whatever it is, and your bank balance is looking pretty empty, you can look at this and all you can see is the negatives. But it's useful to look at these and understand what the challenges are. So yes, your nutrient levels might be really high. It might have had loads of muck or fertiliser or even, you know, sort of things like pesticides thrown on it for many, many years, and that might affect what you can do and when. Already spoken about soil runoff, but also the chemicals that might be bound to that soil. So you might find that the top end of your land is really nutrient poor and the bottom is nutrient rich, or vice versa. You might have steep bits which are nutrient poor, etc. So some of these can be real problems, and if you've got a history of lots of sort of problems on your land, you get disputes, and you might be walking into something where other people have got different ideas from what you have about what you're hoping to do with your land, and you need to go and talk to people. You need to say, okay, maybe I need to just sort of take a bit of time to understand the history of that. And that's really important for if you're going to look at a landscape scale, how does your land fit within a wide landscape? You need to work with these people, and so understanding previous disputes is really important. It's quite often the single thing that stops projects going ahead is disputes on land. But you might have things like invasive species, so that's Himalayan balsam. You might have knotweed or giant hogweed or any of these things, and understanding what that is and what that means for your land and how you might be able to control that or manage it is really important, because that's going to feed into what you might do on your land. You certainly might, so you might choose, for example, not to fence out a stream from cattle if you've got loads of Himalayan balsam on there, because all you're going to do is create a lovely little reserve for Himalayan balsam to spread and do brilliantly well, because the cattle aren't eating it anymore. So understanding what you've got there. Also, is your reserve completely isolated in a very intensive landscape? So if you do all the right stuff, how are species going to get into it? You know, if they've got to travel through a sort of barren, hostile landscape, how are they going to get into it? Now, not many places in Devon are that barren, but you know, it's something to consider. You know, am I on my own in this? Is this the only place in this landscape? I've got my old field where I used to be was pretty isolated in terms of habitat, where I was surrounded by intensive agriculture, and so it took only very mobile species could get in there. I've had to do a lot of work to get anything else in there, because there's no way for other seed or anything of that sort, invertebrates, to get into that piece of land because it's so separated. Finally, problems. Money. God. Managing land costs money, and we've just spent all our money on getting our lovely reserve, and now we've got nothing in the bank. So how on earth are you going to pay for anything if you want to change things? So that's something to think about. And of course, knowledge. You know, you might come into it with all the best intentions in the world, but know nothing about how to get to where you want to be. So problems can be a challenge, but that's exactly where you need support. And support can come from all different directions. And so go out into your local community. Here's a lovely community here, and ask people. So ask your local farmer, well, did they used to graze this land? Would they mind grazing it for a bit? Or has he got a tractor? Could you go and cut that bit? Would you mind cutting my hedges? Go and talk to people, see if they can help you. Foresters or people who are contractors or whatever, they can come and help you, and understanding what different people do, but also try to understand from the local community, do they do it how you like it done, or do they do it how other people like it done? That's going to save you a bother down the line. So getting out and talking to people is really important. Local communities, so a lot of local communities have got things like parish sustainability groups and things of that sort now. So as well as groups like this that operate at a larger level, your parish might have some support within it. And a lot of those have great experts, but they also have things like schools coming out and doing surveys and things. So it's like it's a way of getting people embedded into what you're doing and more support for what you're doing. So if you have got those conflicts, you've suddenly just sort of helped yourself by engaging them. And they can offer you history of the land and things of that sort as well. And of course you might need expert help as well. So there's plenty of expert help out there, and more ecological expertise. They might come with agricultural expertise. They might come with historic, if you've got historic environment, you know, sort of historic features on your land, an old fort, or you know, some sort of pillbox or something like that. What on earth am I going to do with that? I don't know. Right, we'll get somebody in from the county council or whatever. Get a national trust, a wildlife trust, Donna, out to give you some advice on what you could do. And of course they'll come with it with a different eye. But don't just go with the first bit of advice you get. I would recommend you go around 100 people and ask all of them and see which ones sort of resonate with what you want to achieve. Because very often I find that when we go out and talk to people, they met a bloke who told them this was a great idea. And then 10 years later, they're still trying to resolve the issue from that great idea. It probably was a good idea, but was it implemented right? Was it the right idea for the right piece of land? So try and get lots of views on that. One of the other advantages of advisors that are out there, some of them cost, some of them don't cost, but they can help you to maybe get some money. They might know where to access money, so funding, so there's agri-environment schemes, which lots of you might have come across, which the government pays you for managing land in different ways. There might be local grants, there might be little charitable trusts out there that can support you. So these guys are far more likely to know about those things and plug you into other people, like groups like this, that might be able to support you. So it's really important to look for those, ask people, just be really open and honest about what you're hoping to achieve. There's also a load of online tools. I'm going to touch on nature recovery networks later on, but these are some of the ones that I always go to. Some of them might be familiar, others less so. So underneath it all is geology, and it's really useful to go to something like the geology viewer to understand what your geology is. So if you know that you're, I don't know, mainly on an acid soil, but you happen to be, I can never understand why I'm seeing all these oh God, I can't think of a species, a calcareous species now, but I see these calcareous species out on my patch. Why is that? It's because you've got a little strip of limestone that runs under your land, just a little pokey little bit, and it's completely different from everything around it. So quite often this will pick it up, and you'll understand why you've got that. So understanding your geology is really useful, and this tool is really useful. So do go and have a look. You can zoom quite close in and see quite a lot of variation in that. And of course that goes on to your soils again. So there's a UK Soils Observatory, which got loads of information about carbon and all sorts in there. And you can get, this is fairly broad brush stuff on soils, but it probably tells you enough. It tells you, sort of the natural nutrient levels. It tells you about how porous they are, and sort of, are they going to flood water off them as soon as it rains, or are they going to absorb it all? And that helps you to understand a bit more. And then one that I suspect more of you might know about is Magic, which is a DEFRA website that has loads of stuff on it again, and that tells you about where habitats are, where designations are, so designated sites. So when a wildlife trust or the government thinks that a site's important enough, that it'll give it a designation, which helps to give it some protection, supposedly, and might even get some funding in. But it also tells you really usefully where there are other agri-environment schemes out there around you, and that can be really useful for understanding where somebody's farm is. So if you want to find out who's next to you, it might be a way of finding that out. But also it might give you an idea. Oh, God, I never even thought about getting an agri-environment scheme for that. And yet all my neighbours seem to be in an agri-environment scheme. I'll go and chat to them about that. So it's quite useful for just finding out those sorts of bits of information. Explore these things. They've all got different things in them. This last one then is something which I use quite a lot when I'm looking at a landscape, especially when you come to a piece of land completely fresh. And that's the tithe map. It's really useful. So Donna showed these sort of 1880s, 1890s series OS maps. They're brilliant. They're really detailed. Tithe map has another level, which is that they've got the old names of the fields in there. And it's got the cultivation in 1840 in there. And if you go in, obviously the cultivation in 1840 tells you what was on that land in it's 1838 to 1852, I think, is the technical area. But if you know that was arable in that period, well, it's probably arable then and it's probably arable now. But it might have been called Great Heath. So the field name might tell you something about what used to be there before that era. And especially when, you probably can't read these, but this whole patch has got heath in its names. So you look at that and you can go, hang on, all I see is arable and wasteland from a nature point of view, not an agricultural point of view. But that used to be a heathland, clearly. Everything's called heath, and I look at it in the landscape and it's on a little rise, and it's it seems to fit. It's along a sort of ridge that looks like it should be. So this can tell you an awful lot about what used to be there and therefore what potentially could be there in the future. I should stress that looking at historic maps, you need to take it carefully because of course the soils could have altered massively since that time. So if you deep plough heathland soils, chances are you've radically altered them permanently. So you might not be able to recreate heathland, but you might be able to recreate downland, acid grassland and those sorts of things. So those are a load of tools that will help you to think about what you could create. The other thing to be aware of is what you come to the ground with and what your history is. So as an example of that, we've got quite a long history of people moving to the southwest and Devon from the southeast. And if you go to a woodland in the southeast, it looks a bit like this. This is Burnham Beeches. And if you walk, it's got big beech trees and no understory. And your kids can run for miles. You can throw a ball. It's great fun, everything. Go to a Devon woodland. A, it's like that, steep. B, it is a tangled mess of a thing that you can't let the kids, you can't see the kids if they're 3 foot away from you, let alone running across throwing a ball at them. You couldn't throw a ball, it'd hit something and get stuck there. Our native woodlands here are far more like a rainforest, so far more dense and very different from this. And the lesson from this is be aware of what your preconceptions are, and what does the natural landscape of the area where your reserve is, what does that look like? So that's another reason to go to those woodlands around or the fields around to understand that, because that way you go, do you know what, I don't see much of what I thought woodland was supposed to look like in this patch. Why is that? Then you can start to explore it. So it's really important to understand that. I see a huge number of people coming in and promptly planting beech everywhere. I've got a personal thing. In East Devon it's slightly borderline, but in my part of the world, beech is definitely on the non-native list and it shouldn't be anywhere near it, but that's just my personal gripe. So then Bob has done all this research. He's come down from the moon. He's spent a year, maybe 2 years, looking at this site. He's not done anything with it. He's just looked at it. He's sat in a deck chair for most of that 2 years, drinking cups of tea. But now he's in a position to think, okay, what am I going to do? What is my goal? Where would I like to be in 100 years' time? And that's the sort of scale that you want to think about, not where do I want to be in 5 years or 10 years, because everything will go wrong in that time, or you'll get distracted and go off on that mess about with that car or motorbike that you've wanted to do for ages. And so think long term. It's going to take a long time. So what would you like to do, and how would you like to go about it? So what are your limitations? What can you do? You know, that pollution problem needs to be resolved before we can go anywhere. So I need to think a bit longer. I want to get to that, but I'd like to, I need to sort that problem out, so it's going to take me a bit longer. So am I going to go to having my acre wildwood grazed by bison, or am I going to have traditional hay meadow management with coppice woodland? They're two very different and very legitimate courses of action that you could take on the same piece of land. So having done all your research and looked at your landscape and thought about what your limitations are and your issues are, you can now think, okay, what am I going to do? How am I going to do it? Why am I going to do it? And what am I trying to achieve? So I'm just going to go off on a little thing about why we're doing this. And some of it, obviously, a lot of this is sort of stuff for you, but hopefully I'll put a different slant on it and bring it back to why it's relevant to this. So obviously, I think a lot of us hear about the state of nature and all that sort of stuff, and the fact that we're in this diabolically awful situation with, nature crashing, climate in, sort of perilous straits and the likes. And that's the case. And Britain is one of the places where that's really showed most evidently across the world. We've got one of the most nature depleted countries in the world, and we're in a situation where the nature that's left in most of the country isn't sufficient to actually support us anymore. So we're in that sort of strange place where we're in a bit of a spiral. We need to try and arrest that. And the problems are, we've known about a lot of the problems for a long time. Yes, we're seeing, sort of lots of potential extinctions of different species. Yes, we're seeing abundance going down. And yes, the causes, we know a lot of the causes, whether it's urbanisation, pollution, agricultural intensification and the likes, which is generally considered the biggest reason because of area, really, that we have that. So we understand all of that, but how can we look into it? So I just wanted to delve into a couple of things. So a little while back I looked at a grasslands sort of project for a little while and just wanted to understand the history of grasslands. And if you take an example of this, and it's quite useful because it tells you, okay, what can I do? Why have we got to where we are, and what can I do about it? So grasslands reached a peak around the, Bronze Age, Iron Age, something of that sort, when we cleared loads of woodland, but most of our ways of managing things were quite they created almost near natural grasslands and the likes. So you ended up with quite a sort of rich environment still, but a different rich environment from the sort of woodland, more wood-dominated landscape before. Changes in social structure, changes in technology and the likes have meant that we've gone, through this period for thousands of years of reducing that from that Bronze Age, Iron Age peak, where we've gone from all those semi-natural habitats, and they are semi-natural now because we don't see any of the sort of real characteristics of a fully natural habitat in our landscapes anymore. That decline's been going on for a long, long time, and we often hear about this sort of 97% of grasslands being lost in our landscape. It's from a well-known paper. I'll come on to it in a moment. But actually, that's the tail end of a very, very long period when we've probably already lost 97% of the grasslands from before that time of species-rich grasslands. So it's important to think of it in context. And that's not to say that was, that's something we should be fearful of or look, sort of it shouldn't get us down. That's the place we find ourselves in, and we should look for the positives in it. People were doing this because not because they wanted to get rid of species, but because they were trying to manage land for a different purpose, generally to feed themselves or to make an income, to pay the rent or whatever it was. And that's been the case right back from, sort of prehistoric times when people just subsistence farmed, still subsistence farmed, but in a different way in medieval times, but starting to pay rent for land a lot more, so needing money, right the way through to, agricultural revolution and then industrial revolution. You're seeing changes through the landscape. And it's just driven by people needing other things from the land, not because they wanted to get rid of species-rich grasslands. We've got to be really mindful of why we've ended up here. That 97% loss, that comes from a paper by Fuller in 1987 that says between 1932 and 1984, we lost 97% of unimproved permanent pasture, which includes all our species-rich grasslands and the likes. And that is the case. That's what's happened. But also something to note within that is that we also, during that time, started applying lots of fertiliser. Fertiliser became available, it became cheap, it became used everywhere across the landscape. And one of the bigger changes, so I look at 97%, I think, yes, that's a tragedy and we need to try and reverse that. But one of the challenges to reversing that is the amount of nutrients floating around in our system now. So that's happened during the 20th century generally, a bit towards the latter end of the 19th century, and obviously into the 21st century. So that story about habitat loss and a change in the environment, it's really important to understand, because if we want to create a nature reserve, are we going to be able to? Don't know. It might not be a nature reserve that we would have created in 1700, but it might be something that we can create now that might start that process of turning it back into something really valuable for now. A few examples. This is up on Burston Moor up near Hartland, and it's the 1947 aerials that we see all across the country, that are post-war aerial photographs, and it's quite difficult to see in that. So DBRC, our Biological Records Centre, did a little project a little while back just to map where we had calm grassland in 1947, in that image, and that's where they had. By 2007, that was the amount, and the reason for change is intensifying agriculture, so land getting ploughed up, but also forestry in this case. So we saw a lot of land. This is quite poor land generally, so where you see poor land, you quite often see forestry rather than agriculture. And so when you see that, you can start to understand, okay, well, I can understand why those losses are there, because that's poor land, and post-war we needed to produce food and we needed to have timber, so we changed it. But now can we start to look at this landscape with a view to restoring back nearer to that? Take a woodland example. So in woodlands, generally we see the peak of woodlands back in the 7,000 to 9,000 years ago, and by 2,500 years ago we were at 50% of that, and by doomsday most of England was at about 15%. In Devon we were at 3.8%, so we've had a very long history of removing our woodland. So that's sort of quite it's a challenge for us to understand, okay, well, how on earth has anything survived in this landscape? Well, we're fortunate in having this landscape, which means that things that rely on woodland can survive in this landscape, because they get to use all these different hedge networks and little farm copses lurking in there, and these small fields, a bit like big woodland glades. So you can see the value of this, what we see as a sort of still a worked landscape, actually is providing a sort of safety net for all those species that are woodland species. They might probably benefit from a bit more woodland in that landscape, but they're surviving in there. But even those hedges have been diminished. So 1947 aerials again, this is a bit of interpretation by DBRC again. This is an area near Marlborough, down in South Devon, and you can see that we've got a very hedged network there and a very poorly hedged network there. This goes back onto Donna's images of earlier on. And likewise, you've lost things like the small little woodlands that went on the edges of those, because if you're going to create a big field, you're not going to leave a little corner of it to woodland. You're going to take that out. You're going to take the orchards out. And the mature trees tend to disappear because they tend to be associated with hedgerows. So that landscape, which was supporting those woodland species, is now not supporting those woodland species. And an example of that is cuckoo. These are the records for cuckoo on the left between the 70s and 80s, and then on the right in the sort of noughties and what do you call the teens? I don't know. Call it the teens. So this is a bird which relies on lots of different habitats, because so woodlands, heathlands, wetlands and the likes, and scrub. Because it parasitizes its host species, things like dunnocks and reed warblers and things of that sort, which live all over the place. So it's actually quite a good indicator of a whole load of habitat, and it's completely gone from being everywhere in Devon to being in just quite a few places, mainly around the moor. It's also a good example of where a species has been affected by pesticides, because it's an insectivorous animal, and so pesticides have both directly hit its prey, but also taken out its habitats. So when you see species like this, I mentioned earlier on about, sort of understanding the species and how they, how you can look at them and go, okay, I've got that here, therefore is it good or bad? Well, if you had cuckoo in your 1 acre, you'd be like, happy days, I've got something brilliant here. But most of us haven't. So, and I should say that, we shouldn't be all doom and gloom about it. There's a good example, as I'm working a lot on this little critter. You can just see hiding in that tree up there is pine marten. Nature is quite resilient and persistent if you give it a chance. So Donna said earlier on, you can recreate a meadow. Species do come back. Some of them take longer than others, but also they're quite resilient at staying in a landscape. And the example I give here is, I mean, it might be a little bit harsh because pine martens did go extinct in Devon, but this is the numbers of pine martens that were trapped and killed, unfortunately, but between about 1500 and about the mid-19th century, at a time when our woodlands were at 4% in Devon. So its habitat was at 4% coverage. It was being persecuted in every way, shape and form in that landscape, and yet it survived at low levels across the entire landscape. So we shouldn't be surprised. And the same thing happens, you find little colonies of things like marsh fritillary butterfly and the likes popping up, and they've just survived in little pockets somewhere, and then they're able to recolonise. So nature is resilient, and if you give it a chance and you create your little nature reserve on your acre, you'll find that things do find their way back in there, and even after a long period of change, they might just survive. And of course, that's why organisations like ours and the whole conservation sector has been having nature reserves for 150 years, because they recognise that to protect, if you take those little pockets and protect them, the best bits, then you protect a whole range of species with them. There are other processes now where you can do things like landscape scale work, where we work with all of you lot and other farmers and other landowners to say, well, what could you do in your little bit to help this species? And that's a good example of that is searle bunting at the bottom, where working with a whole range of farmers across a whole landscape, you can save a species from extinction. It was right on the verge of extinction in the UK, but it's now doing really, really well. That's because each farm has got a little acre on it, which is providing a network for that species to thrive. And they've returned, they've bounced back, not because every farm gave up every last bit of its farm or did everything differently. It just tweaks here, tweaks there, little nature reserve here, little nature reserve there. So they're really important in the landscape. I'm not far off the break, don't worry. I'm going to talk about natural processes because I think it's really important. So we talk about habitats and species a lot, and everyone recognises that as a sort of. I think a lot of people grasp them, but natural processes are really fundamental. They're the way that niches are created, those opportunities are created, and there's broadly two classes I've broken down to. There's thousands of different natural processes, but I've broken them down into a couple. There's the physical natural processes and the biological natural processes, broadly, physical led. So physical natural processes might include fire and flood and coastal change, storms, snow. They're quite disturbance related. They create change, they move things, they shift things, they break things, they smash things. And they're the sort of natural world almost without biology. Obviously fire relies on biology and the likes, but they're really sort of chaotic and they're really important. But of course, they work really effectively in a landscape which is massive and full of habitats and wildlife all over the place, because that makes it adaptable and change. But when you've only got one little reserve there that gets smashed in a storm or gets flooded or gets burnt, as we're seeing a lot at the minute, then that makes these can be problematic and a challenge. They're not something we can do an awful lot about. Some things around flood and the likes you can do about. The other processes, and there are some biological disturbance agents out there as well. So wild boar is a really good example, and anyone living in the Forest of Dean would know all about that. Really useful tool, but yet again, really useful at a really big scale. Get too many of them on an acre, and I think you might have a bit of a problem. But yeah, really valuable for churning things, creating change, allowing new stuff to develop. The other biological ones, though, are more the stabilizing agents in our world, and so you got things like predation, succession, which a lot of you might have heard of, but also, you know, composting, dealing with dead stuff, and sort of churning it. And they all, what these do is these are really important for these cycling materials and nutrients and water. So whether it's carbon or phosphorus or I've lost my track, any of those nutrients, and they're really important. And without them, you take one feature out, so you take a predator out of the landscape, you completely change that whole system. That cycle doesn't operate the same anymore. If you take dung beetles out of the environment, you get a very big change on both going up the, you know, to the predators that eat dung beetles, but also down to the effect that dung beetles have on the environment. They cycle nutrients in the environment. And succession, the same. You know, it's like if you don't allow enough succession, then you gradually lose woodland, for example, or you only get a certain fixed component of the landscape and you miss the middle bit, maybe. These are really good stabilizing features. So they capture energy. So if you poured water on a rock, it pours off and the rock's dry again within a moment. You pour water on a really rich woodland with soil and understory and canopy, it just soaks in, takes ages to get to the ground, let alone getting down to the rock underneath, and it just holds it and only releases it slowly. And that's the same with all of these. Biological natural processes slow things down and stabilize things, and they enable habitats to develop. So it's really important when we think about this, not just to think habitats and species, but also natural processes. And that's what, you know, I put the "re" in brackets there, because we're calling it wilding because of the sort of difficulties of going back to something before, and we don't necessarily want to go back to something before. And as I said before, quite a lot of the time you can't go back to something that was before. So, but rewilding or wilding is a process about restoring natural processes. It's about putting your energy into making the processes work and then letting those processes determine what happens on the land, rather than you saying, I want 0.84 hectares of this particular type of woodland by 2047. That's a different way of doing it, but this is another way of doing it. And obviously this is the Knepp Castle estate in Sussex, which is a really good example. I'm sure everyone here has read Isabella Tree's book, but it's a really good example of how when you stop and think before you go out onto your reserve with machinery or animals or whatever, which way are you going to go about it? What are you going to do? Which thing are you going to create? Why do you want to create it? And who are you creating it for? Which species are going to benefit? Which are not going to benefit? So all this is the end of the first half of this talk. And what I wanted to get you to think about is making slow decisions is a much better place. Taking your time and thinking about it is a really important part of this. Talking and learning from people is a really important part. And we quite often skip that step because we're so champing at the bit. So I've spent a fair bit of time saying how do you plan, and I did have some slides on here which I will go through, but just very quickly now, just to say a bit more about planning, but then we'll get onto the practical stuff, and that's what I think a lot of you want to hear. So I think most of you will recognise this. I've talked about landscape scale an awful lot. You've got to think about how your acre of land fits into a landscape. This model by John Lawton back in 2010 captures a load of work that's gone on for 40 years and suggests, okay, which part of the landscape are you? Are you one of these big bits, or are you a new bit, or are you a little stepping stone? And chances are an acre is probably going to be a stepping stone. And you might look at that in a landscape like this and say, okay, where am I in that? And depending on where you are and what you can provide, and it might be that your acre is part of a much bigger site, might be just on the edge of this patch here, then you might be have a different role in that. But I think generally assume that you're going to be a sort of stepping stone place on a corridor somewhere, and therefore your your role is, yes, to support the species on your site, but also to enable things to move through that landscape. That's a really important part of your role as a nature reserve and what your nature reserve is going to give to that landscape. So I mentioned that there was something called Nature Recovery Network, which I've worked on for about 5-6 years or so, which is now becoming part of a sort of statutory process around local nature recovery strategies. I won't go into that. But just to give an example of how you can use a tool to help you understand which habitats are near you. This is all available on the Devon County Council Environment Viewer, so do go to there and have an explore. This is the sort of layers on the right, and you can click about with it. And don't worry, I don't think you can break it, although I can, because I can go in behind it, I think. But so what this does is tells you a bit more about your landscape. I'm just going to run through a very quick example. This is out, where is this? Dunkerswell. So I've just picked 3 little yellow blobs on the map to show where your acre might be. What on earth are you going to create there? I don't know what to create there. So this layer just shows you the core habitats, the really important habitats that are designated out in your landscape. So the pink is wetland, the purpley colour is heathland, light green is grassland, and the dark green is woodland. And if you look at that, then you can say, okay, any one of these is quite close to a whole mix of them, and that might tell you what you can create there. If you look at lower value habitats that are out there, you don't see a huge change at the minute. There will be more information going on that soon. But this left-hand one now sits right in the middle of a woodland block, or at least that's what comes up. So it might be you want to think about, okay, I'm going to manage this site for woodland, but it's also got some wetland right there and some grassland. So what are you going to do? Maybe a mix of all of them. The really important bit I wanted to discuss was this habitat suitability mapping, and this is based on soils. I'm going to take that off and just go to that instead. So this might tell you what you can create and what you can't. It's based on the soils, and it tells you, okay, if you are in this place, I can't get that to stay on, this site here, you could look at creating like a mix of lowland fen with woodland, birch woodland, or purple moorgrass and Welsh pasture with birch woodland. And that's sort of habitat that you might expect to be able to get on that little patch there. So it gives you a good inkling. It also gives you a list of other habitats you could create. So this, by looking at the soils and what sort of habitats they support, this tells you the most likely thing that you can create there, so sort of primary and a secondary. And hopefully this gives you a good indication not only of what habitats are out there, so those previous slides showing what is already there, but this tells you what maybe you could create on your land based on the soils, the landscape, the geology, etc. And from that, you can then do a little hand sketch and say, well, what could I create? Now's my dream time, I can create it. And so now you can say, okay, I'm going to zoom right in on Bob's acre and say, right, I know that the neighbour's woodland goes up there, and that links up to that big triple SI up the road, and there's the river that goes down here, and that goes down to the estuary just down the way. I know that I see otters and frogs using this all the time, and I know because I got in touch with the Record Centre that they see bats use this here, and that links to a flyway that I know about. So I know that I've got some species I've got to look after. I know I've got a range of habitats in my site because I happen to be in the bottom of a valley with a little river and a pond and all the likes. So now I'm going to start thinking about what I could do. And the reason I say about doing this is because it's much cheaper to make 15 of these and decide which one to go for than to go out on your land and do 15 different ways of managing your land and then go, oh, that didn't work. And going, oh, I can't, I've got to fill that pond in now. That's a mess. So have a play around and see what would work. What habitats can you restore? So thinking about the connectivity. So can you do some in-stream dams to re-wet some fields and slow the flow because it keeps flooding the neighbour out just down the way? There's a wet grassland just down the way that I saw on that map. How could I link to that? Maybe I need to create a bit of wet grassland in the bottom of mine as well. So maybe I could remove some old field drains that would help that to happen. So by doing a little plan like this, you give yourself a chance to explore the options. And once you've done all of that planning, you get to doing stuff. Hooray! I'm going to touch on like 3 main habitats here. So grasslands, woodlands, and a little bit on streams and the likes as well. So managing open habitats, you're basically primarily trying to stop succession. So succession is the process of going from bare rock to big forest, woodland. And you want to hold it at a certain point. It might be that I hold it at a very near the bare end or nearer the scrubby end, but you're generally trying to choose an area and depend on what habitat you have naturally in your area and what you're trying to look for. So in this main image, you're looking at sort of things like calm grassland from this sort of area right the way across to Cornwall, across mid-Devon and likes, and that's quite a sort of tends to be quite a tussocky, scrubby sort of habitat. Whereas if you're on a limestone hilltop, you're going to probably end up with quite a sparse habitat, and that's maybe going to affect the animals you choose and how you halt that succession. So, if you're going to halt succession, you've got two main ways of doing that. You've got grazing or you've got cutting. So if you touch on grazing. So grazing's obviously the natural way of doing things, and actually grazing, if you think of the mechanics of it, is the nibbling off, the trampling and the dunging, and that's a little process all in itself, and that the mixture of trampling and cutting is really important within that, because the trampling is the bit that actually creates an awful lot of the diversity. The cutting just stops stuff getting too big, and it recycles a lot of that material off the top and takes the growth out of it. Depending on what you're looking for, you're going to choose different species. Now, different species come with different challenges. So if you've got, the best generally for biodiversity, I think most people would recognise it, are cattle. Because they're big, heavy animals, they create lots of little niches in your ground. They tend to have quite a sort of chaotic way of eating. They just go around and just like, I'll have a bit over there, I'll have a bit over there, and they're not fussy in that way. They just sort of smash themselves around. If you've got scrub as well, they'll smash into a bit of scrub. Sometimes they need a bit of help to open it up a bit, but they'll help to really create a really diverse landscape. So in that sense, from a result point of view, cattle are best. And if you're looking for the type of cattle for a nature reserve, you want that sort of breed that's able to stay out a lot, but also able to tolerate sort of quite rough grasses and roughage. So you're not looking for a sort of Holstein generally. You're looking for these sorts of guys, sort of Devon Reds, those old Galloways and things of that sort, Dexters. If you've got a small acre, with only a bit of grassland in it, you don't want big cows. I'll come on to stocking density in a moment. But the challenge with cows is, of course, they're tricky to manage. You need a lot of skills to manage them. You probably need a lot of kit to manage them, or you need a neighbour who will help you with that. And so you've obviously got the TB issue. So if you've only got an acre and you've got 2 cows on it, and you have a TB test, then you've got to think, okay, what am I going to do about that? Because I can't keep 2 cows on an acre for more than a few weeks or a month, depending on what the ground is like. So they're complicated to manage. So they're the best, but also the most challenging. Probably the easiest to manage are sheep, but they're generally the worst for biodiversity, mainly because, unlike the cattle, they go around and they see a flower in the far corner over there, and they go, I'm going to go and get that flower, nibble. And then, oh, look, there's another one. And they'll keep going round and round and round, and they're like if you have a buffet and you can just keep going back, you're always going to take the chocolate cake and, I don't know, whatever your favourite is, the sausage rolls, whatever it is. And that salad bowl, I'm not going to worry about the salad bowl. But if there's only a salad bowl and a piece of bread, you're probably going to have some salad and a piece of bread, and that's going to be what you have. Or if you only get one chance, you might get a bit of everything. So sheep can be brilliant, but if they're managed right, they're easy to manage. So I've got a few sheep, a few old Shetlands, very old things, not very agriculturally useful, but conservation-wise, they're quite good because I can move them around quite easily, and I can keep them, sort of just squeeze them into a small patch for a little bit. But I do recognise that my grassland doesn't look as rich as it should do because they keep grazing out the flowers and the likes. The other one is ponies, the Dartmoor pony, and ponies can be a really great tool especially if you've got quite rough ground and if you've got a bit of woody stuff around, because they like to browse a lot as well as graze. And so if you've got that sort of habitat, but you can use them sort of as a halfway house between cattle and sheep sometimes. And on small little plots like an acre, actually being able to borrow some Dartmoor ponies would be great. Now you can do the same with horses, but horses are much more difficult to manage generally. The danger is they're much more sensitive to what nutrient they take in. They can get a disease called a condition called laminitis. If they take in too much nutrient, that can kill them very quickly. But also they can create a lot of damage very quickly because they're much bigger. And so for an acre, I would probably say steer clear of horses and think ponies. So everything you go little. If you're going to get cattle, get little things, because then you can have a couple more of them maybe, and they'll create more diversity. So about stocking density. So your acre is not going to hold many animals, and if you are looking at buying animals yourself, you want to make sure that you're considering the site in winter, not in summer. So if you're thinking, oh, it's an acre, I reckon I could put half a dozen sheep on there or a couple of cows or whatever. But come winter, when it looks like this floor, they're not going to survive very well. So you might only actually on an acre just have a handful of sheep if you bought them yourselves. But if you brought them in, you might then look at having 10 sheep in for 3 weeks, and they'll do a really good job, and then hand them back to somebody else. And I'd broadly say, especially when you're starting, borrowing or renting in animals is by far and away the best way. But whichever way you go, you will need fencing, you'll need water, you'll probably need sort of some way of getting them in there, so access for a vet or a shearer if you've got sheep. You might need to have a crush or some sort of setup for getting them into the corner. The number of times I've chased my sheep around the field when the shearer stood there leaning against his truck going, oh, smallholders. But it is useful. It's useful to have that set up already, and that all costs money, and you've got to think ahead about that. Some farmers will put out a bit of electric fencing, and that can be a good, sort of way of tackling that. And there are even things called flying herds. So in South Devon, in the Avon Valley project, we've got a really great little small setup called Cows in Clover, and they go out and they basically lend their dexters out to a series of acre type size places, and they just stay on there for a week or 2 weeks or whatever it might be that you need and they need for their cattle. That's a really good setup. Obviously it's limited by things like TB if they get a problem with it, but that could be an option if you, especially in a group like this, you need a communal grazing approach, and you don't want all the responsibilities yourself, because it is a big responsibility. These animals will live for quite a long time. They'll get a lot of problems, no doubt. And so just sort of thinking ahead to those sort of different options. But they get the best results, and grazing is a really good system for, if you think about what we would naturally have in the West Country, you'd have sort of free roaming animals moving around, and a lot of our habitats have evolved out of those grazed landscapes, and that's and I've seen some of the most species rich grassland that I've seen, and woodland for that matter, have been where we've got a mix of all of these wandering around the place, including sheep. They can really do so. If you're going to get livestock, you've got to really think about how are you going to go about it, how are you going to manage them, and what happens if it goes wrong. Do I need a barn? Barns are expensive, and on your acre they take up land that do you want to spend money on that? Do you need winter feed? Do you really want to winter feed on your lovely lake nature reserve? Preferably not. So there's a lot to think about, and you need to sort of plan ahead what you're going to do if, where are you going to take them? Have you got another acre down the road? So when I was saying about what other bits of land like yours are in your landscape, that's exactly why. Does your neighbour have some cattle or sheep that you could borrow? And I would start with that. When you do start with livestock, go low, go way, way low. So for a nature reserve, you're normally looking at a grazing, a grazing density of something like half a livestock unit a hectare, which is basically probably one small, very small cow, or 5 sheep, or something. That's actually a livestock unit per hectare per year. But you're looking at very low numbers, and I would go a bit lower than the lowest that you expect, and gradually increase, because it's very easy to cause damage very quickly with grazing, with big heavy animals, but also with little sheep. They can create a lot of puddling and the likes when they get there. Increase it. The other thing to bear in mind is if you're borrowing sheep, is the tenant or grazier got the same sort of aspirations as you? And therefore, do they understand what you're trying to do? If you've got a tenancy agreement, you're going to have to be very strict. It's a great way of handing over control to somebody else. So if you haven't got the skills or the time or whatever to do it, you can let somebody else do it. But you need to be really strict about what you will expect of that. If it's a grazier, it's a bit more flexible, but of course that could also be termed unreliable. So they're still on your land 3 weeks after you wanted to get them off your land. So it's that. Maintaining those close communications, most farmers are fantastic and will help you, especially if they see somebody come and they're not quite sure what to do, so they'll help you to sort of move them on. Cutting. So you can do this by hand or with machinery. Cutting is, obviously I had to include Mr. Poldark there just with his scything prowess. I'm sure we'd all look like that if we scythed every day and took our tops off. But so cutting is a really useful tool. As I said before, you've got to think about access and steepness, rocks, and things like that in the ground. Have you got, have you got the place for this equipment? If you're going to own this equipment, that's a lot of money. You can go to old sales and pick stuff up, but it quite often breaks down. So if you've got the skills, you're going to pay a contractor to do that or take it to local engineers. But you could borrow it, but that comes at cost as well, or get a contractor to bring it in. There are things like machinery rings. So Devon Wildlife Trust has machinery rings for various pieces of equipment. So you could look out for that. It's another thing that you could consider. It's quite a challenge to manage those things. So not many survive for that long, unfortunately, in terms of machinery rings. The other thing to think about there is what you're trying to achieve. So if it could have a hugely beneficial effect. So if we think of all the hay meadows around the country, they've been one of the key places where we've maintained a really rich diversity of species within quite small packages. So if you think of 1 acre, if that's a mix of habitats, it might only have a relatively small number of species. A single wildflower meadow could have hundreds of species and amazing soil structure and all the rest of it. But if you've got a load of ant hills there and you're running a tractor over it with a cutter, you won't have ant hills for very long. So is that something you want to, if you've got to look at what you've got and say, is it appropriate? And what you're trying to achieve. It could be that you're going to do it on just a part of your land. And I'd say, don't ever cut if you can't rake off. So we all know, we can. I've got some really good. I'm working with a solar farm at the minute, and they keep telling me, "Well, I don't understand. We've been cutting the ground for ages and ages, and we thought after 6 years we'd have reduced the fertility and we'd be able to." But they're just cutting and dropping all the time, and the fertility is going up constantly. It's gone from a 3 to a 4 on the phosphorus index. So if you're cutting and leaving it, you're absolutely really causing problems for your land, and your chances of actually getting any sort of habitat is really low. So if you can't remove it, don't cut it. You're better off leaving it. If you can't do your whole area, why not just do little pockets, little parcels out of it? Do you need to cut the whole lot in 1 year? Why couldn't you just split it into 3, 4, 10, 15 and cut little pockets out of it? And that way, all the invertebrates could stay in those uncut bits, and you could give shelter for all different species and foods for different species, while the open bit is cut and you're helping that seed. And obviously those taller bits have still got seed hanging on them, which might drop into those cut bits. So it's a way of sort of managing what you have to do while retaining diversity. If you can cut the whole lot, do please leave a margin around the side of long grass and areas in the middle as well, preferably if you can, with longer grass, because that's where all the invertebrates are going to hide when you cut it. And you think of things like crickets and which like short and long, then that's really important. And as to whether you use machinery or hand tools or whatever, and you can use like pedestrian mowers and things, there's a whole load out there, and it's probably a case of exploring what you can find, and how whether you want to look like Mr. Poldark and put the effort in and the grunt in, or whether you'd rather sit on a tractor and do it, or get somebody else to sit on the tractor, or get somebody else to. You could get a team of people to come in and scythe your land for you. I'm sure there's people out there who do it, and so think about your resources in doing that. I should just say that for some open habitats you can also trample. So think about that as another option. It's for very small patches. You do it with bracken, we do it with some ruderal species. You could actually do it with parts of grassland as well. And I think actually it gets better results in some places as well. If you're going to restore grassland, the first thing, as ever, let it grow. See what's in there. So you got there, you don't know what's there. Let it grow for a year and see what comes up. Even if it looks really intensive, there might be that little pocket in the corner which has got loads of stuff in it. So have a look. If it's really grass rich and there's no gaps at all anywhere, you can't see a gap down through at all, then obviously yellow rattle is a species that you can use. You can sow into it to help it parasitizes grasses and can reduce their vigor. It can have mixed results. It can be absolutely dominant, and the next year you're going, I've got no grass anywhere. What on earth has happened? And in other places you get one pop up, and you think, oh, that was a big effort for not very much, and for some reason it hasn't taken. And it can move around a field as well, but it's a really useful tool for managing really rich grasses. So, and you'd include that in a seed mix, which I'll go on to now. So if you're gonna restore a grassland through seeding because you have left it, you might have left it long and go, do you know what, I'm just going to carry on just taking a hay cut and just see what happens. And actually 9 times out of 10, just doing that hay cut will bring back the species richness. There's probably a load out there, there's a load of seed in the environment, and it'll find its way in. So just changing the management is the first port of call. If you don't think that's going to work, or if you've tried that for a little while and nothing, you're not getting very far, or you're missing some species, you can look at seeding. And generally we'd say now over sowing, so don't plough and create bare soil. Generally try and keep some grassland there, because you think of all the invertebrates living in the soil. Do you really want to plough that up? There's implications for your soil health, your biodiversity, and potentially pollution into rivers as well. So do you need to do that? Could you rake your ground? If you're only doing a tiny patch, you could harrow it, disc harrow it, or chain harrow it, or you could run a load of stock over it and graze it down until it's got some bare earth. And you're looking for normally, I think they say 30 to 50%, although I think it varies a huge amount. And Donna will attest to the value of mole hills on a very small patch. If you've got moles, they're brilliant for seeding into, so they can be really useful. So that's what you want to do as your preparation before you seed. And then you've got to go somewhere else to get your seed. So either green hay. So the guys from Gorham Farm, obviously they have done a lot of green haying and they provide seed. Come on to seeding in a minute. You can do this, from literally going out with a set of shears and cutting a few bits off, or you can go with a pedestrian mower right up to what we've done in the calm grassland area for many years and decades now, of using huge pieces of kit and big bale choppers and the likes. And basically you're going to a site which has got a good range of species in it, species-rich donor site, and you're harvesting the hay and taking it as quickly as you can, collecting it, either bagging it or putting it into bales and bringing it on the same day to your site and spreading that hay, so as it dries it drops its seed. There are challenges. You need to probably consider the distance between your site and the donor site, because that grass is going to heat up very quickly as it composts, and that'll kill the seed very quickly. There's practical issues. How on earth are you going to get it from A to B? You need to have both sites ready to go on the same day. So all that prep for your site, plus all the prep for that site and all that work going on. If you're using volunteers to help, then you've got to have everything there on the same day. So it's a brilliant way of having a great celebration. Actually, that's down in the Avon Valley, and we cut from Longmarsh and took it to this site near Averton Gifford. And Donna, you were there actually, weren't you? And then We did all of that in one day. It was I think that's me cutting the grass at Longmarsh actually, and it's a huge effort, but it's a brilliant way. If you had everyone in this room doing it, you've done a huge amount. The other way, which is probably becoming more popular, is seeding. So either going to a supplier and buying seed. Obviously, if you're doing a small amount, that can be really beneficial because you can choose exactly the seed you want. But if you're doing very large areas, it can get more expensive. And obviously, we're trying to make sure there's local provenance in this as well. So if you've got a suitable site near you where you could harvest seed using a brush harvester, but also just going out and picking seed heads off, going and just collecting seed yourself, leaving them out to dry and then shaking them off and then collecting that seed up. And storing it to dry it, or you can go straight out onto your acre and put it straight down on wet, whichever one works. And you can, depending on whether you're going to store it or not, you can clean the seed off and really sieve it out. Or if you're just going to get it straight out, you can do the sort of halfway house between green haying and seeding and keep all that sort of chaff and the likes in there and all the stem heads and everything like that in there. So you can do that, and the advantage of this is you can go back to a donor site multiple times through a year. So if you've got early flowering species, you can pick them up. If you've got late flowering species, you can pick them up. For any of these harvesting methods, you've got to be really careful about affecting the donor site. You don't want to take too much, and that's the same for if you go back to the same road verge and pick that flower that you really like. Don't go and pick every head off that whole thing, otherwise in a couple of years' time there won't be anything there at your donor site. Try and hold yourself back, just take a little bag of them and then go back. And the same if you're harvesting, we always tend to just take a third or over a farm, just do a third each year across the farm. And then you can spread that out on the site. And this is an early photo when we did a really big piece of work up in the Culm area. So we did take it down to bare soil. It can have really quick results, but you can also have ups, downs, randoms. So the key here is don't panic. You could get a really big year of oxeye daisies, and then the following year almost no oxeye daisies and loads of docks. Then the next year you get loads of thistle, and then the next year you get loads of birdsfoot trefoil, and it's like it seems to go through these cycles. Ancient grasslands take decades and centuries to settle, and even they have little ups and downs. So don't panic. Don't go out there with the sprayer to try and control all those docks. Just think, those docks are providing food for all those birds and invertebrates out there. So maybe I can let it go for a bit. If it's getting too much, go and pull a few, take them out. But be patient. We're looking at woodlands then. Woodland management is much more about leaving a lot more. Try and resist the urge to tidy. So a lot of our woodlands, especially small woodlands like in an acre, would actually benefit from a lot more chaos and deadwood. So whether deadwood's on the ground or up in the sky hung up, or whether it's standing, then that's really valuable habitat. So when we've got small farmland woodlands or small woodlands pretty much anywhere, a lot of that deadwood's been taken out. Small trees have been taken out. So think about what can I leave? Can I leave as much as possible? If you've got things like ancient trees or big veteran trees, consider it's called halo thinning, trying to clear a space around them so that they can have a bit of space. They're probably getting crowded out. You can see a big tree like that in the middle of a woodland must have grown in an open environment when it first grew. So can we create a bit of space around it so it can thrive again, so it's not just shrinking back on itself? And ancient trees are very good at regenerating themselves like that. You probably need to think about whether you can do the work or whether it's a contract job. And different contractors out there in the environment will have very different approaches, and you probably need to work with a few and figure out who's your best contractor. There are people who will do things like horse pulling out. And also, if you're looking at wanting to be productive on the land, you can also look at things like coppicing, so you can still get some firewood out or timber out, and it can help things like fritillary species that are reliant on that. Hedges, woodland planting. Yeah, are you going to plant, or are you going to grow your own from seed? So you're going to plant stock, you're going to grow your own from seed, and are you going to let it naturally regenerate? So on an acre, I would say why not let a corner naturally regenerate? It's probably as good a way as any. There will be oak seedlings everywhere. I'm getting the rush, so I'm going to move on. Hedges. Clearly, these are really important in our fragmented landscape. Hedges provide a really important both connectivity, but a habitat in its own right. Loads of things like berries for birds, loads of flowers for insects and things in hedges and on the banks under hedges. And so managing them, flails have caused a lot of damage. They've still got a place in managing hedgerows, but trying to talk to contractors to not push it right tight. And you could just go along with a hook, and that's how they used to manage them. Just hook off the overhanging branches and just take them back enough, let them grow up, and then consider coppicing again or laying them. So if you've got a gappy hedge, then you lay. If you've got a thick hedge but you just want to take it back again because it's grown up a bit too tall, just coppice it down and it can come back nice and bushy, and leave some standards in there when you do either of them. So you leave some trees standing, and that provides a route for bats and things of that sort. Streams. So streams shouldn't be straight generally, especially in Devon. I'd say they should be all over the place. And so if you see a straight stream, we used to have we've got sort of a history of drainage and wanting to keep water moving off of our land. If I saw a straight stream, my temptation would be to throw a rock in it or throw a tree over it and try and force it to move around. And by doing that, you actually hold back water and stop it from just barreling down and scouring out and then taking those nutrients down. So can we create little dams in there? It's a sort of lot around natural flood management. But if you've got a stream, you're lucky enough to have a stream in your land, then this is an opportunity. You could create habitat for a huge range of things. And obviously we're mimicking these sorts of beaver wetlands down here. But you can do that on a small scale just by throwing a few logs across. I should say, for anything like that, you need to get consent, drainage consent from the local authority. So you need to sort of talk to them about what you can and can't do in there. But you can do a huge amount. Taking out field drains, so we've lost nearly all our wetlands. And I think 99% of wetlands lost globally. And in the UK, it's probably about the same. So just take out a few field drains. Let that bit next to the river just become a real bog again, and you'll probably find that you get more invertebrate mass there than pretty much anywhere else. How dynamic? I'm going to skip over that. You'll have noticed that I talk a lot about watching, sitting, looking. Keep records and see what happens when you do stuff. Try and record what's happening. See how things are changing. And also feed your records back to both, if you're doing a bird census, then sending it back to BTO or to RSPB or whatever, but also send them to your local record centre, in this case Devon Biodiversity Record Centre. That way your results are not just helping you to understand your land, but they're helping other conservationists to know what's out in the environment so that they can understand how you fit into that. So that recording is really important, whichever type it is, whether it's habitats or species. And the last thing is just enjoy it. It's lovely. Who wouldn't want to have an acre of land as a little reserve? Get your deck chair out, go and sit there with your cup of tea and absolutely love it. If you're into sharing it, get a few friends round and get them to help you, but get them to go out there and enjoy it as well. What you'll be doing won't be complete in your lifetime. So no habitat will be created in a lifetime, but you can start the process and you can see a huge amount of change. And on an acre, you can have a really big effect, whereas on a whole farm, it might take you multiple lifetimes and you might not see the effect, but on an acre, you can have a huge effect. So get started, go and have a look at your land and enjoy it. And I'm going to finish there. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'm aware we've run over a bit. Anybody needs to leave now, otherwise we'll just have like a 5-10 minute Q&A session.
Are there any species of plant that you should be looking at removing, other than the sort of invasive knotweeds and things like that? I'm thinking things like brambles and gorse, but they need cutting back and keeping.
The challenge on an acre is that you could have bramble and gorse all over it. And if that fit into the landscape really well and provided, you know, a really crucial part of that landscape, your thing that you could be really proud of is that you've got an acre of bramble and gorse where nobody else has, and that's supporting loads of species. So dormice and invertebrates and birds all rely on those species to, you know, to sort of provide food through the year. So I think managing a small nature reserve is a real challenge. Normally what we try to do is get a balance of a number of different habitats. So you'll actually probably control several species. You're going to manage your grassland and stop it succeeding. So when scrub is encroaching, you might keep it back. So whether that's bramble scrub or gorse scrub or blackthorn encroaching from trees or from the hedges, then you might control it. I don't think there's anything I would say control for the sake of it. You know, wherever you see it, control it. Gorse is a much underrated plant in my view. I think it's hugely valuable. So I'd definitely not control that, except where it's really taking over something where it's having a detrimental effect, like you're losing a species-rich grassland for gorse. Having a patchwork effect is a really good way of looking at it. I think this gentleman here. Oh, bracken. Bracken also really, really valuable. And the challenge with bracken is that we've got so a lot of these species we're seeing a lot of, so lesser gorse, but with bracken and bramble is because of that nutrient increase that we've got in our environment. So those are species that can really take advantage of high nutrient environments, and that's why. But also where we've removed woodland, you know, we've lost, you know, what we in Devon we're at 11 or 12%. So we've lost like 90% of our woodland, and woodland would have kept bracken into small areas. And so when you've got a very open environment that would have historically been woodland, yeah, you've got bracken. So you can manage bracken, but I wouldn't get rid of all of it. A lot of our invertebrates rely on bracken. So it's about, again, about trying to create a balance between the two. Push it back into corners or into patches, but leave it, and don't leave it just in one patch, leave it in a few so that those species can move through that environment.
What about horsetail? We've got some in a corner.
Is that horsetail? Yeah, again, you get the same horsetail and hemlock and all of these species. I think a lot of that is about, there is a nutrient element to them as well. There's also disturbance causes quite a problem with that. So when, as I said about being patient and letting things sort themselves out, what you tend to see is you get these bursts of things like horsetail or hemlock coming in, or hemlock water droplet, especially when a wetland's been disturbed, or that, you know, sort of damp grassland's been disturbed over many years, or it's been improved over many years, and then you've changed the management, and those species take advantage of that. And what you probably need to do is wait for a while. But yes, you could control that. You know, yet again, creating patches. If you're concerned that something's really dominating, you used to get a lot of concern around meadowsweet just pushing out into everything, where it pushes out from wet grassland into dry grassland, and people wanted to push it back. I think it'll probably sort itself out over time, but if you want to push it back, don't get rid of it completely, but just push it back and control it. If you've only got an acre or a very small site, try to get a bit of diversity, so long as that isn't the only site where you get that species in that whole landscape, in which case you might want to think, I'll have a bit more of that. That sounds okay. This gentleman was one. Yeah. Do you want that one, Al?
Oh, sure. Just thinking about the problem of species not being able to arrive in your reserve because maybe you're isolated, you haven't got the connectivity to places where they exist. What's your view on reintroduction of species? And I don't mean lynxes and wolves. I mean things like butterflies or small mammals, invertebrates generally. Is that a feasible thing to do?
Sorry about that. Yeah, so reintroductions are, they're increasingly becoming a really important part of how we manage landscapes, but they're very complicated and they're high risk. So you can invest a lot of time and effort trying to bring back a large blue butterfly or a particular fritillary or whatever. Or in my case, I'm looking at pine marten, and other people are looking at different plant species. So you can invest a huge amount of time and it might not work. And you might have other risks, like what happens to, what's the welfare of animals, or what are you knocking out in the process, where you're taking them from. So they have a part to play, and a really important part to play. The thing I would say is reintroductions need to be quite strategic. So if a whole network across a landscape decided, you know what, we've lost, and the obvious example is things like water voles, we've lost them from an environment and we want to try and get them back. It'd be very hard for a single landowner to do that, and even for invertebrates, I'd probably argue most invertebrates, it's difficult to make the case that you should investigate a reintroduction on your own and carry it out on your own, because it's unlikely to survive on a very small parcel within a hostile environment. It's probably better to look at, can we get a whole community of people across a landscape with similar habitats or that would support that missing species, and then could we look at, is it appropriate? So I think it needs to be much more strategic if you're doing reintroductions, because the risk is higher, there's a lot of investment in it, and you could be investing that in other things. So first of all, look at all the stuff you've got already that isn't doing very well, can we make that do better? And then look, okay, what we're missing. The only alternative to that is just where a species has a really clear function in the environment. So if it's a keystone species that transforms the landscape, or if other species or parts of an ecosystem rely on that species, then bringing that back could be something that you do as a sort of strategic goal to try and enable that habitat to be in a better condition. That's our justification for things like pine marten or whatever. So, but yet again, you need to really think carefully. It's a big investment, and they can go wrong quite easily. Large blue is an obvious example where there've been successes and failures of that after decades of work. So but it's a really important tool. We've lost all those species. Let's look at where we can bring them back where it's appropriate to. Yes. There's a microphone coming to you over there.
There's a microphone.
My question was more of an open one, and I don't necessarily need the answer to it this minute. It's to do with widespread ignorance about the importance of species-rich meadowland. And I went to an event in Sidmouth, which was run by Sidmouth Council, called a Change for Good event, and it was very anti-farming, and it was very anti-livestock farming, and I took the impression away from it that if someone absolutely had to eat meat, that they should do it very occasionally, and it was a terrible thing for the environment. And I did raise this issue with them afterwards, and they said if I'm involved in the meat industry, then I'm part of the whole setup that involves the destruction of the rainforests and the growing of soya and all that kind of thing. And we are actually vegetarian. We let our land out on the grazing licence. The farmer is an organic farmer, and he sells to Waitrose and to Marks and Spencer as organic beef. But I know of other farmers farming species-rich meadowland in the Sidmouth area, and they're trying to sell their meat locally, and people are completely unaware that that is actually something that they could do to benefit the environment. And I was wondering if there's any avenue for people like yourselves to be able to be speaking to councils and government bodies to educate them.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, so most of the conservation organisations recognise the value of, or the differences between different agricultural sectors and their different benefits and impacts. They all have both, or most have both, and I'm recognising that. And clearly, we've just said that if you want to manage grasslands, the vast majority of the West Country is pasture land. Even if you removed, sort of highly, the really intensive agriculture, you'd want sort of low intensity grazing land as a really key proportion of that. And the key way you'd manage that is probably cattle and ponies and things of that sort. Discuss, should we eat ponies? Probably. I think the key thing here is that we need to listen to each other and have a respect within conversations. but also recognise that none of us in this room are educated enough. We can all learn from something about somebody, and that some of us have got expertise in other things or in different things, and maybe we could help and we could chip in. So where people don't understand how to manage grassland, then they come to Moor Meadows and to Devon Wildlife Trust, whatever. If you need to understand about livestock farming, then you go to farmers. But maybe mutual conversations between the two, maybe find the common ground. And there is common ground. And I think there's a lot of work to do about that, exploring those conversations. That's why I said right at the beginning, go and talk to people, go and talk to neighbours, go and talk to advisors, because they do have a role. Now, intensive beef and dairy industry, yeah, absolutely. There's big problems there, but extensive livestock systems that are supporting species-rich habitats in the West Country and potentially providing a local source of food, and especially where that's not demanding, carbon-rich feed and things of that sort, where it's much more grass-fed or whatever. Those got a really important part in managing our landscape. So, but that's quite complicated and niche, and I think a lot of the messages that get out into the world are simplistic because people, they don't take it in. It's not interesting maybe for them. So we've got to try and get those messages across in different ways, but try and get a sort of conversation going that's respectful and open and the likes, and then we move forwards, hopefully, rather than just getting on opposite sides of a wall and shouting at each other.